Thank you for those of you that are here for coming on time. It's good. There have been so many Zooms over the last few years, but it's good to see that still attracting some attention. So for those of you here, what Richard and I are planning is a real event later on in the year, aren't we, Richard? So let's hope
so. Indeed, yes.
Happened. Okay, so I think we'll kick off now for the sake of keeping to time. So again, welcome to all of you to 2022 and to One Step Beyond's first session of this year. It's great to see so many of you who are actually returning to our sessions, and also to see our UK and international audience growing. My name's Sophie Jump, and I'm the co-founder with Richard Siddle, whose face you can also see, of One Step Beyond, which creates events for the drinks industry, which are wrapped totally around consumer innovation and technology. So before we start, a quick shout out to our partners who've supported us through our virtual manifestations in various forms over the last few years. So WSTA, the UK Wine and Spirits Trade Association, thanks for all their moral and logistics support. PIX, which is the brand new wine discovery platform, which connects wine lovers and retailers directly. Stranger and Stranger, which is one of our industry's most renowned brand development, design and packaging agencies, and Fresnay Copestick, which is one of the fastest growing and influential drinks brand businesses. So today we're getting in deep into behavioral science and how it can be used to transform brands and business performance. And I'm really excited to introduce you all to Richard Shotton, who you should be able to see on your screen. Richard will lead the session. He's the author of the best-selling book, The Choice Factory, which is all about behavioral science and how it can be used to sell things, which should apply to all of us. And his work focuses on applying findings from psychology and behavioral science to marketing. We're also delighted to welcome Nick Modi, who's the Managing Director of RBC Capital Markets. Hi, Nick. And Nick will be looking at the 5 themes which are expected to take us into hyperdrive in the drinks sector. Sorry, that's hyperdrive, not hyperventilation. We hope, Nick. keep it real. Nick is ranked amongst one of the top analysts across the consumer space, and he covers companies with a combined market value of $1 trillion US. So I think it's probably no wonder you've lost your hair, Nick. So we're going to round up the session with a discussion with Nick and Richard and our panel of experts. So thank you to them who've joined us from Stranger and Stranger, PIX and Fresnay Copestick. So any questions asked by the Q&A. Before we kick off, Richard Siddle, anything you want to say quickly before we launch in?
No, just to say thanks for all coming on board. As Sophie says, we've got really interesting session hopefully for the next 90 minutes, and yeah, please use the Q&A, and please, if you can, if you are going to ask a question, can you make it relevant to what we're actually talking about rather than going off on too much of a tangent? It'll be very helpful. But otherwise, yeah, really looking forward to it, and again, thanks for all your support.
Brilliant. So Richard Shotton, I'm going to pass it over to you to launch in. If the rest of us can turn off our audio and videos, that's brilliant. Enjoy, everybody.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the intro, Sophie. Today's session is going to be an introduction to behavioural science, and in particular, the application of behavioural science. Now, if you're not familiar with this term, it's nothing complicated. It's what people used to call applied psychology. It's essentially the idea that people have so many decisions to make every single day. They don't have the time, they don't have the energy, they don't have the wherewithal to weigh up those decisions in a fully considered manner. So instead, they rely on shortcuts, what psychologists call heuristics. And they use these shortcuts to make fast, speedy decisions. What's interesting to us, if we're marketers, if we're entrepreneurs, if we're business owners, is that those shortcuts are prone to biases. And if we're aware of those biases, when we're creating our communications or designing our products, we can essentially work with human nature rather than against it. So hopefully, from that very brief description, you can see the relevance. But maybe beyond that, the other reason I think it's worth spending a bit of time chatting about this topic, it's not just that it's relevant, it's also pleasantly robust. And often a lot of the ideas, certainly in marketing, but also in business in general, they're not robust. It is quite different. I think it's one of the more unique things about behavioural science, that it's evidence-based, that it's not based on my speculation or my intuition. It's based on peer-reviewed, observed experiments. So we can give these findings genuine credibility. So that's what behavioural science is and why you should be interested. The only downside, though, and I want to address this straight up, is this topic can sometimes feel a bit confusing. You know, there are thousands of these biases, thousands of these experiments. So it can sometimes be hard to know where to start. And that's a real shame. You know, I think we want to move behavioural science from something we discuss to something that we apply every single day in our jobs. And if we're going to do that, we really need to simplify the topic. The best way to do that, I think, is to use one of the frameworks that are publicly available. Now, there are lots of frameworks, these simple sets of rules and processes for applying the topic. There are lots of them available, but the one that I thought might be a nice way of structuring the session is to discuss one of the more famous ones. So this is the EAST framework. It was designed by the Behavioural Insights team back in 2012. And the Behavioural Insights team, by the way, if you haven't heard of them, are an organisation set up by the Cameron and Clegg government. And their aim was to try and make sure government communications were at least informed by behavioural science. And one of the best things they did was distill this really broad topic down into 4 key principles. So EAST is an acronym, and it stands for make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, and make it timely. And what I thought we could do today is go through those 4 principles, discuss the broad idea, talk about some of the evidence supporting those ideas, some of the nuances, and then most importantly, of course, talk about the practical recommendations that come from these ideas. So that's the plan. And I think we'll take, about 25 minutes more. So I'll take you through that quite quickly, and hopefully it will stimulate a few questions so that Richard and I can discuss those. Now I'm going to mix up the order slightly. Rather than follow E, then A, then S, then T, I'm going to jump to the 3rd principle, the S of the EAST framework. And it's the idea that we should make our brand, our products, whatever behaviour we want to encourage, we should make it social. Now that's slightly confusing terminology, because that might lead you to think we're going to be discussing social media. But this has nothing to do with Twitter or LinkedIn, but rather it's a much, much older idea. It's about an idea called social proof. So social proof is the theory that when people make decisions, they don't do it as fully discrete individuals, but rather they look around to what others are doing. And if a course of behaviour looks like it's commonplace, that behaviour will become more appealing and people are more likely to do it. As I mentioned at the beginning, that's not just an intuition from me or people who've actually come up with the idea. All of this is based on experiment. There are lots of social proof experiments, but probably the most famous comes from a man called Robert Cialdini, author of a wonderful book called Influence. And back in 2008, Cialdini, who was at the time working at Arizona State University as a professor of psychology, he recruited a hotel chain to work with him in one of his experiments. And he persuaded that hotel chain to let him alter the messages that ran in guest rooms, encouraging them to reuse their towels. Split the rooms into 3 groups. And the first set of rooms saw this message: please reuse the towels, help save the environment. Very similar to the standard messaging you see in a hotel. Now, when he ran that message, 35% of guests reused their towels. So remember that number, 35%. That's essentially the benchmark. That's the control. Next set of rooms, Cialdini strips away any logical, rational reason for compliance, gets rid of any mention of the environment, and instead he makes it clear how most people behave. So the message says, please reuse your towels. Most guests do so. And we see a jump of 25, 26% in terms of towel reuse. So 44% of people reuse their towels now. Now, if that was a one-off experiment, we could afford to ignore it. But of all the experiments I discuss, this is the one that's probably been repeated most regularly, whether it's in tax repayment rates, music downloads, smoking, obesity, again and again and again. If you tell people what most people are doing, that will increase the likelihood that that behavior will become even more popular. So we can give this finding genuine validity, being proved in a huge range of different circumstances. And you can see many marketers kind of using that idea. You know, this idea of if you tell people what's popular, it'll become more popular still. You know, brewers like Brewdog, you go on their site, and to avoid choice paralysis, what they do is they highlight the bestseller on their site. Or stretching to non-alcoholic drinks, you can see for Nespresso, they're trying to encourage people to subscribe. They highlight the most popular pad. Simple, effective ways of shaping people's behavior. But I did mention that there were 3 different sets of rooms that Cialdini ran this experiment. And in that third and final group of rooms, Cialdini changed the message again. This time, he wondered if social proof would be more powerful if the display of popularity was among a more relevant group. So in the final set of rooms, he says, please reuse your towels. Most guests who've stayed in this particular room have done so. So it is a tenuous link with the audience, but it's a link nonetheless. And that was the most successful message. A full 49% of people reuse their towel in that scenario. That's a 40% improvement on the control. So what Cialdini shows here, and other experiments have backed this point up, is that if you're going to make a social proof claim, mentioning your bestseller or your most popular product, or the fact that you sell 1 million bottles a week, actually it's more powerful if you serve tailored messages to different audiences. So, you know, that could be by region, where someone lives, their demographics, their kind of knowledge of the category, anything to make the social proof message more tailored, it will become more powerful. So if that's a bit abstract, what I mean by that, on a very, very basic level, better to say 100,000 people in London users to Londoners than say 1 million people in the UK users. That would be a tailored social proof message. But these ideas are all reasonably commonplace in marketing. I mean, I think, you know, we could argue they should be used more often, but they're reasonably well used. Where I think social proof becomes interesting is when we start exploring the nuances. And it's a very, very well researched bias. There's lots of different experiments on social proof. And one that I love, and I think this would be relevant to anyone that is trying to sell online, is in a study by a University of Texas psychologist called Peterson. And in 2019, he recruited a large group of people and he showed them an e-commerce page and got these people buying products. And one of the products was not available, let's say. However, what happened is that the label for that product varied from group to group. So a third of people saw that the product was unavailable. And on a 5-point scale, they rated their level of disappointment. And when it was unavailable, let's have a look at the disappointment with the website, the score of 2.83 for unavailable. And high is bad on this 5-point scale. When it was framed as being out of stock, the irritation of the website, disappointment with the website, shrank slightly, 2.72 out of 5. But when that product was framed as sold out, the level of disappointment was lowest for both the website and the individual product. So I think it's a 16% drop in terms of disappointment levels. Now, why this relates to social proof? Think about the subtle suggestion of those terms. If you go to a website and something is unavailable, what's suggested is that company is a bit inept. They're unable to manage their stock. If something is labeled as sold out, what it implies is it's hugely popular. It's emphasizing the demand more rather than the administrative capability of the website. So by subtly hinting at social proof, it reduces some of the irritation levels. And what I love about this is it is a costless intervention. It's not the biggest intervention in the world, but it's a costless intervention. You can test this on your website tomorrow, and without any cost, you can find out in a week whether this experiment that Peterson ran works for your site as well. But it's also, I think, treat this experiment as a guide to the future studies that I talked to you about. There are simple ways of applying these biases, literal ways of applying them, but also, like Peterson, you can make slight leaps with the basic principle, and then it opens all sorts of practical opportunities. So that's our first principle. If you want to encourage the sale of a particular item, stress how popular it is, stress that popularity is tailored, and stress that it's growing in popularity, and you'll be harnessing social proof. Now, that's the first of our principles. The second principle is an idea of make it attractive. And this is probably the broadest of the ideas. So I could probably spend the whole half hour, probably the whole day talking about make it attractive, but for the benefits of all of us, I'm going to focus in on one very specific area. So how do you make prices attractive? And here there are some lovely studies. If it's an area you're interested in, you can definitely talk more in the questions. But I want to take you through hopefully what is a very relevant experiment for many of your categories. So it's a study done by Mountain View, and they set up a bar, and at this bar they sold Carling for £1 or Budvar for £2. And 2/3 of people picked Budvar, 1/3 bought Carling. Next, they introduced Tesco Value Lager for 20p. Now, Tesco Value Lager, and hopefully no one works at Tesco, but even if you do, you probably admit it's not the greatest tasting of beers. And so even though it was selling for 20p, no one, literally 0 people bought that lager. But what's of interest to us is what happened to the Carling and Budvar sales. Now, 47% of people bought Carling, 53% bought Budvar. So roughly half-half, whereas previously it was 1/3 Carling, 2/3 Budvar. So even though no one buys Tesco Value Lager, its very presence changes the popularity of the other products. Now, to test this wasn't just an aberration. The psychologists get rid of Tesco Value Lager. They launch, or they add, another beer, Kronenbourg Blanc, super premium, £4 a bottle. And then they see what happens. Now, £4 is a lot when you can buy a beer for £1. So only 10% of people buy Kronenbourg Blanc. But again, what should interest us is this ratio between Carling and Budvar changes. Now, no one buys Carling, 90% buy Budvar. The psychologists call this extremeness aversion. It's the idea that when we pick a product, we are not solely evaluating on its inherent attributes, its quality, its price. Yes, they're important, but that's not our only metric. What we also look at, whether we fully realize it or not, is the relative position of that product. If it's the cheapest of those on offer, many people will reject it for fear of being poor quality, for fear of the reflection themselves. But likewise, people will reject the most expensive option, fearing it will be overpriced and they'll look like a show-off. People gravitate towards the middle. Now, again, this idea that's been proven experimentally, both for beers, for coffees, for popcorn, for electrical goods, you can take this idea that's being run by academics and you can apply it in a commercial setting. So let's imagine you run a bank and you have 2 accounts. So Tide, British bank, mainly for businesses, and they offer a free account with some options and offerings, and then a plus account for nearly £10 with an additional range of offerings. If they want to get more people signing up for that paid account, because it's probably the higher margin one thing they can do, harnessing Extremeness Aversion, is encourage that upgrading without having to spend more money on giving a greater package of benefits. They can do that by introducing a super premium offering. So for $49.99, the value of that super premium offering is not in its direct sales. Maybe no one buys it. Its value is in shifting people, just as with the beer, from being happy with that free product to now thinking that's a little bit extreme, and therefore people are more likely to shift to the middle version, the plus option. Now, that idea is very easily applicable. You can take this experiment, you can apply it tomorrow on your website if you're running a subscription service or any kind of e-commerce site. But you can take, again, that principle and apply it laterally. So the underlying idea is that we judge the value of a product by what we compare it to. So it seems very simple, but you can take that idea and you can make huge amounts of money from it. I would argue Seedlip have done exactly that. Now imagine an alternative universe where Seedlip launch, not packaged in this beautiful craft gin style packaging, not cited in the alcohol aisle, not labeled as a non-alcoholic spirit. But imagine if it's exactly the same liquid for exactly the same purpose, but it was situated in the supermarket next to Robinson squash and the Ribena. If that happened, suddenly the comparison set of products would all be £3 or £4. No one would pay, even if this was the most wonderful tasting liquid in the world, would pay more than £5 or £6 or £7, because they'd constantly be referring back to what is a reasonable amount to pay, the natural occurring comparison set of Robinsons and Ribena. But what Seedlip did so brilliantly is they have created a comparison set of craft gins. Now that's a creation. That's not the necessary comparison set. These comparison sets are fluid, but by citing it near the gin, looking like a craft gin, referring to it as a non-alcoholic distilled spirit, they've shifted the comparison set, and suddenly people are paying £20 for it because it's a little bit cheaper than a £30 bottle of craft gin. So again, you can take the underlying principle of extremeness aversion, price relativity, you can apply it literally by introducing that super premium version, a third offering if you currently have two, or you can think about it more laterally like Seedlip. There's so much opportunity there. And again, if people are interested in that, perhaps we could discuss the Nespresso example where they've made even more money than Seedlip from some clever uses of price relativity. But that moves me on to my third principle. So make it easy. Now the argument here, which really draws mainly on the work of Daniel Kahneman, so Nobel Prize winner back in 2002, is that when people think about behavior change, they put too much emphasis on changing people's motivation levels, getting them excited, getting them desiring a product. Yes, that's important, but what Kahneman argues is even more important is making the desired behavior as easy as possible. In fact, Kahneman, in a recent interview, said of all the things that he's learned in his 50 years of running behavior change experiments, he said the single biggest thing he's learned is that it's often far more effective to focus on making desired behavior easy rather than changing motivation levels. Again, even though Kahneman is illustrious, we don't have to take him on his word alone. Some lovely experiments that show the influence of even tiny bits of friction. So this is a study from 2017 by two American psychologists, Bergman and Rogers. They worked with the British Department of Education, and they launched a new service for parents. So as a parent, you could sign up and you would be texted advice on how to encourage your children to revise. The psychologists persuaded the department to launch this service in 3 ways. The first way, what they called the standard way, they texted people, a random group of parents, information about why the service was amazing, And then they said, if you want to sign up, click on this link. The link took you through to a web page, and it took 2 minutes to sign up. In that scenario, 1% of people enrolled. That's the standard hard to sign up variant. In the next scenario, another randomly selected group of parents were texted exactly the same information, but this time sign up was made slightly easier. There's no form to fill in. People just had to text back the word start. 8% signed up. So we've got an 8-fold leap in sign-up rates just by removing this tiny bit of friction. Next scenario, this is pre-GDPR, so no laws are broken. This is the auto-enrollment scenario. This is the easiest to sign up scenario. Here, people were texted the same information, different group, randomly selected, texted the same information, but they were told you are signed up if you don't want to be, text back the word stop. And in that scenario, 96% of people signed up. So we've got a 95 percentage point difference in sign-up rates based on really, really small bits of friction. So this proves what Kahneman's saying. Small bits of friction can have a disproportionate effect. But then came the clever bit. Next, the psychologists go out and recruit experts. So these are academics, teachers, head teachers, the like. And they say to them, look, we're going to run this experiment. Here are the 3 scenarios. What do you think the sign-up rates will be in each of the different scenarios? Those experts weren't stupid. They knew that bits of friction would have a negative effect. So they got the direction of change right, but they were wildly wrong in terms of the scale. They thought 38% of people would sign up in the standard version, 44 in the simplified, 66 in the auto-enrollment. So they thought there would be a 28 percentage point swing based on small bits of friction, whereas in reality, there was a 95 percentage point swing in behavior. Bergman and Rogers argue these teachers are typical. Again and again, in all sorts of walks of life, marketing, business, academia, people underestimate the impact of friction. And what that therefore means is, if this is the case in your company, what it means is that almost by definition, you're likely to be putting too large a proportion of your funds and time into motivational change, too little into making that desired behavior as easy as possible. So the argument would be, go through the customer journey and identify even these small bits of friction that feel like completely inconsequential, and put more effort into removing them. Remove steps on the checkout process, like Amazon. Move from 2 steps to 1-click purchasing, or like Netflix. Don't even require people to click to engage with your products. Get it auto playing. Move people from having to purchase each week to subscription. Pre-populating forms. Lots of things that we know we probably should do, and we do some of it, but Bergman and Rogers' argument would be we don't do it enough. Now, there are lateral ways of applying this, and there's some lovely drinks examples. So if this is of interest, let me know and we can talk about this more in questions. But that's our third principle. Essentially the idea that people are too interested in changing motivations when they want to change behavior, and they should spend more time making the desired behavior as easy as possible. So on to our final and quick principle, make it timely. And the T of these framework essentially argues that the same message, the same bit of communications from a brain can have wildly different effects dependent on when people hear it. And again, it's quite a broad topic, so I'm going to focus in on one area in particular, and it's about habits. So there's an argument from psychologists that a lot of our behavior is habitual. I think we're going to talk about non-alcoholic drinks later. The argument would be, well, when you go to a pub, if you haven't had a non-alcoholic drink before, you don't weigh up at the bar what to do. You just default back to your previous behavior. You don't even consider all the different ranges of drinks you could have. You pick from a much smaller selection of things that you've done before in similar circumstances. Now, that's brilliant if you've got an existing customer, but it's pretty awful if you're trying to get people to change their behavior. You want them to drink non-alcoholic, you want them to drink your new launch brand. How do you do that when people aren't even weighing up all the different alternatives as to how they could behave? Well, psychologists don't just list and describe the situation. They don't just tell us what the problem is. They also tell us about some of the solutions. Psychologists have identified many predictable moments when habits are weakened. And these are moments that you should focus on if you are trying to change people's behavior. So one area, and this is an area I've done a bit of research in, is around the destabilizing effect of life events. So by life event, I essentially mean that people have undergone a big destabilizing event in their life, married, divorced, moved house, that type of thing. And back in 2017, I surveyed 2,370 people, and I asked them 2 questions. So first of all, I gave them a list of life events and said, tick the ones you've undergone in the last year. I asked them a few filler questions, put them off the scent. And then I said to them, here's another list. These are list of brands or categories. Tick the ones where you've got a new favorite brand, or tick the one where you've tried a new brand. I then crossed those 2 bits of data and saw a very clear pattern. If people had undergone a life event in the last 12 months, they were 2.5 times more likely to try new brands. And that was across all the categories and all the life events. This wasn't just about relevant life events. We'll come back to that. So here's the data in a bit more detail. Lager was one of the products I looked at. So 10% of people who hadn't undergone a life event had tried a new brand or got a new favorite, whereas people who had undergone a life event, that jumped to 27%. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't just about relevant life events affecting us. It's not just people have babies and they try new nappy brands and new pram brands. Well, of course they do. It's much, much broader. People get divorced. They're more likely to try new lagers. People move house, they're more likely to try new TV programs. It's a much broader impact. What seems to be happening is that people recognize habits are a brilliant way of navigating a complex life if it's a stable environment. But when the environment changes, they recognize the habits are no longer so useful. And in this very broad arena, they at least consider other alternatives to their past behavior. It doesn't mean they will change, but it means they're much more likely to consider, and therefore you have an opportunity to change their behavior. So if you want to change people's behavior using digital media, and that's one of the great things, I think we get this fusion of technology and behavioral science, using digital data, discreetly identify someone who's undergone a life event and target them. They are going to be much more open to your suggestion. And then the other big implication of this, and it's a short-term one, but I think it's maybe even a larger one than the previous suggestion, which is you could argue COVID is like a life event. And it's shaken up some of our behaviors. The focus in most discussion at the moment is about how there will be relevant changes to people, less likely to go into work and therefore fewer coffee shop sales. Now, of course, that's true. But I think what's not discussed is that this research and other bits like it suggest you'll have meaningless churn as well. People more likely to try non-alcoholic beers, people more likely to switch from Coke to Pepsi. Churn that isn't related to, or the category isn't necessarily related to COVID, but the fact that we've had such a environmental change will weaken our habitual purchases. And over the next 12 to 18 months, we should expect a greater degree in churn in behavior. So if you are arguing for budgets and arguing for your kind of marketing spend at the moment, I think this would be a bit of evidence that maybe would support the need for at least a maintained budget, if not a greater budget, because you want to be on the right side of this churn, not the wrong side. So those are our 4 principles. I've only scraped the surface here, but hopefully just going through 4 or 5 experiments has at least piqued your interest and shown that behavioural science can be relevant to business and that it's something that can easily be applied, especially with a little bit of lateral thinking. So hopefully of interest. And I don't know, Richard, or anyone else out there, if you've got any questions, then it'd be great to chat them through.
Thanks, Richard. That's brilliant. Yeah, I know we spoke before about went into many of your various different areas of science that you look at. It's just fascinating in terms of, as you say, there's just hundreds, aren't there, of these these sort of like tools that you go into. Can I ask? I mean, I know that you know you've set out some really good business commercial cases there.
Yeah.
In terms of actually how you get involved working with I don't know, a Coca-Cola or a Procter and Gamble or a, I don't know, Fever Tree or whoever it is that you work with. I mean, what are the steps? I mean, how do you get yourself in there in the first place, and what are the things that they come into mostly for?
Well, I've got a bit of a soft spot for the drinks industry, because the first client I ever had was Brewdog. So the founder had read the book and then messaged me on Twitter and said, well, could you take these ideas and experiments you've done for other people, could you apply them to our business? So a lot of the work has come post writing that, the Choice Factory. And then what I tend to do is people will set a question like, how do we encourage people to spend more in our restaurant, or how do we reduce drop-off rates on our e-commerce site? And what I'll generally do is go and look at the psychological papers, do an academic review, and take the most relevant findings and say, look, here's the bias that I think is most relevant. Here's the evidence for it. And then, look, knowing that, these are the kind of lateral leaps you can make. This is what you should practically do differently. Yeah. And what I think is so interesting for brands is you can do this. It doesn't need to cost much, because it's like we've got this army of researchers out there. All these academics, their papers are available at almost no cost. So we've got this body of work that's very relevant to pressing commercial questions. It's just a case of structuring it, finding it, and then thinking of the application.
Yeah, in the same way, I suppose, people bring in consultants to analyze their business. I mean, essentially, you're bringing you in as a behavioral scientist to then say, based on what you've told me, I think this would be particularly relevant to your company as opposed to what I might be able to help with somebody else. Yeah,
and I think the nice bit is like if you get into kind of marketing strategy and theory, it's often speculation. It's beautifully and powerfully argued ideas, but the difference with behavioral science is logic is never enough. You can't just argue something from first principles. Everything has to be proved experimentally. So there's this body of work which I think can give people greater faith that it is actually going to have an effect, rather than being an intellectually pretty theory.
Yeah, actually, what struck me actually is, I mean, the wine industry in particular, and it's relevant as well for spirits, but particularly for wine. Everybody involved in wine always talks about this disconnect they have with the consumer. There's wine industry, you've got masters of wine. Virtually everyone's got some sort of wine qualification. It's sort of the most industry in the world. Well, not the world, but one of them. And yet they're then trying to communicate with consumers who aren't necessarily interested. And I know there's a whole load of science around that, isn't there, as well?
Yeah, that's a great point. There's a lovely idea from a Stanford psychologist called Lee Ross. So back in 1977, he comes up with this idea called the false consensus effect. And what he does is he recruits, and this was amongst students. So back in the 70s, there was more work with students, which has gone out of fashion because they're not exactly represented, but this has been shown amongst other groups. So there's a genuine insight. So he reads them this story, and essentially the story is you've been driving through a 30-mile-an-hour zone, you were doing 40, you've got a speeding ticket, but when that ticket arrives at your house, it's riddled with technical errors, wrong car number plate, wrong dates, wrong colour of the car. So you did speed, but there's a loophole potentially. And he asks, would you contest the fine or would you accept it? And then, and this is the real experiment, he says, and what do you think other people would do? And the finding is that if you would contest the fine, generally you think the vast majority of other people would. If you wouldn't contest the fine, you just take it on the chin, you think the vast majority of other people would take it on the chin. So Ross called this idea the false consensus effect, the idea that whatever attitudes, behaviours and values we have, we don't think they're universally held. I mean, people stupid, but we think that they are more commonly held than they actually are. So if you're different from your audience, that is quite a big problem, because the false consensus effect suggests you will assume that, or you're more likely to assume that the audience is interested in the same things as you. And I would imagine, apart from probably music, I would think wine might, as you say, might be the category where how people purchase it and what aficionados like about it are probably the most wildly different. So the danger is you end up creating marketing that appeals to you and other experts, not how most people are behaving in a situation of excess choice.
I mean, I know you can probably spend a week answering this question, but so just roughly, how do you start doing that? I mean, is it about simplifying the message, going back to what you were saying in your presentation about the real skill in cutting it all down to like a one line rather than a 1,000-word analysis?
Yes, so I think in terms of the process, I mean, East is one model. There are lots of others, things like Mindspace, Combi. Normally, if you have I'd use the East as an aid memoir. So if you've got a problem like, well, no one is picking our non-alcoholic wine, you think, well, how do we make it as easy as possible? How do we make it as attractive? How do we make it as social as possible? How do we make it timely? And you think about those kind of associated experiments and which ones could be applied to that particular challenge. So something like non-alcoholic drinks, which I think is a fascinating area. You might draw on that. There's an experiment by an American psychologist called Raghunathan. I think he might be at McComb's Business School, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But what he did was he sets up this buffet and he serves Indian food, Indian drinks, so mango lassis and things. And he gets people to say, how much they like the food, how much they like the drink. And the twist in the experiment is half the people are told the mango lassi is healthy, half are told it's unhealthy. And when people come to rate that drink, the group that think it's healthy rate it significantly lower in terms of quality than the group that think it's unhealthy. Now, remember, the lassi is exactly the same in both situations. It's just the labeling. What Raghunathan argues is that our expectations influence our experience. If we think we're drinking a very expensive wine, it will taste nicer. In the same way, though, we assume that if it's healthy, it's probably going to be worse tasting. So you've got to really, that would be a fascinating study to then think about for your marketing, which would be, well, what I think many non-alcoholic drinks do problematically is emphasize what you are missing out and emphasizing that you're giving up something, that it's healthy and good for you. That's going to negatively impact taste. And if people are skeptical about that, the brilliant thing is, I've described Raghunathan's experiment. You could go out and work and rerun that experiment tomorrow, change the Indian buffet for French food and French wine, give people a little bit of a different description. Some get one, some get another. You could test it and know the answer by 5 o'clock tomorrow. So, you don't have to take any of this on faith alone. All the experiments are easily rerunnable.
Yeah, and I guess if you're working with websites, you can get that immediately.
Even easier. Yeah, even easier. I mean, yeah. Because the great thing is you really want people, any of these experiments, and Raghunathan's was a great thing. Everyone thought they were testing, foods or whatever. Actually, it was this 2 different stories that was the key thing. You want to reach people when they don't know they're in an experiment. And obviously, when someone goes browsing through your e-commerce site, they don't know if they're taking part in a A/B test, a split test. So yeah, e-commerce is a brilliant way to test these ideas.
There's a question here from Thomas Lewis, actually, because you mentioned in your presentation around the whole life event.
Oh, yeah.
And people changing their behavior. And I know there's been a lot of talk in there about people going back to sort of familiar brands, people returning to big brands during COVID. Is that something that actually is true, or is that sort of more of a, people, is that I mean, obviously big brands push that message out all the time.
Yeah,
is that actually what actually happened?
So it's probably worth splitting out maybe that very first, if there's, and this is, I'm not talking from a psychological perspective, so speculating, but one maybe at that very early stage, people switch to something that feels reassuring. That sounds plausible. What I think the argument, though, from life events, and there's other studies, like there's the idea of the fresh start effect, which is essentially the same point, but for much on a smaller scale, but more regular scale. So there's an argument that when we enter new time periods, start of the month, start of the year, start of the week, we become more likely to change our behaviour. So the argument is, I've not seen that argument was, does it benefit big or small? Most of the research is about, does it increase the probability someone will change what they do? So it could be from big brand to big brand to small brand to big brand. Most of the research I've seen is on that area, increased change, not on type of brand that benefits. But there are lots of these different moments that psychology have shown have increased of churn.
Well, I guess dry January, joining gyms in January, going on a diet in January full stop.
Exactly. So, I mean, it was, Milkman, who's at Wharton, she said the reason she did her study. And so what she does, she looks at things like the volume of search terms around things like quit smoking, start exercising. Yeah. She looks at gym attendance and registration data. And she knew there was a big spike in January. You can't live in America without knowing that. But she wanted to see if it happened again and again. And what she shows is that it happens, after your birthday, after holidays, beginning of a week, beginning of the month, you get these pronounced spikes in an increase in behaviour change. And her argument is people want to be consistent with their past selves. But when we undergo the change from one section of time to another, our link with our past selves weakened, and we're at least therefore more open to change. Now, the evidence that it happens is quite powerful. Whether you believe her explanation is of why it happens, then that's kind of more speculative.
Good. Okay. I should just pick up another question actually from Justin Howard Snade, who's just the word organic. Now, I suppose in vegetables, organic seems to be a good thing. If you've got organic vegetables for your dinner, it seems. Whereas organic in wine doesn't seem to have, well, again, anecdotally to some extent as well, but it doesn't seem to have quite the same connection or understanding. Would you think there's any reason around that?
Yeah, so I think here, what there is a lot of evidence for is the power of labels in shaping expectations. So there's a wonderful study from, I think it's Loftus, where she gets a video, and it's not as gruesome as it sounds at first, of a car crashing into a wall. So it's like a safety test type thing. And she plays the video to lots and lots of people. Some people are asked, how fast do you think the car was going when it crashed into the wall? Others, how fast do you think the car was going when it bumped into the wall, when it collided with the wall? And you see this change in the estimation of speed based on the word that's used. What she argues is, even though we're seeing exactly the same thing, how we interpret it is shaped by the language that's used. So that can translate into food, certainly. There's a study by Levin where he serves people minced beef, fried beef. Sometimes they're told it's 25% lean, sometimes 25% fat, sometimes 75% lean. And people think the food is greasier when they're told it's 25% fat. He's drawn attention to that particular attribute. Now, so we've got, first of all, language shapes people's expectation and what they perceive. That perception, Levin showed, will then go and affect our actual experience. Then I think you get to that question as well, what effect is organic going to have in our particular category? And that's when I think you really should move to an experiment, because it could be, in many walks of life, people think there's a trade-off. So they might think, well, people don't tend to be good at everything. So if they're really good on their environmental footprint, what else is suffering? And there's some evidence for that, like the health improves in Raghunathan's experiment, we expect taste to go down. But a confounding factor, I think, for organic and wine might be that people assume that companies that are going to the effort of using organic ingredients are going to the effort in lots of different areas. And there's a lovely study from Morales at University of Southern California around what she calls the illusion of effort. So she recruits people who are in market for a house, and she gives all these people 10 flats that meet their requirements. Half of them are told the estate agent got this list together in an hour and they did it with a computer. Half are told that the estate agent took 9 hours and they did it manually. They got the list together 9 hours manually. Later on, they're asked to rate how good the estate agent was. and you see this increase of, I think it's from, it's 36% in terms of the quality rating of the estate agent if people thought they had gone to lots of effort. Now, you could argue that's ludicrous. What matters is how good their service is. But that's hard for people to judge. So they slip into judging the service by something that's easy to grasp, how much effort they've gone to. So yeah, this idea of the illusion of effort suggests maybe actually for wine, emphasizing organic might tap into that. But I think once you're getting down to those very specific questions, the simplest way to do it, and you shouldn't be spending more, if you did it yourself and everyone did it themselves, a couple £100 or you could do that test. Get 100 people together, serve them exactly the same wine, half told the wine's organic, half aren't, get them to rate it later on the taste. End of the evening, you've got a robust experiment that shows the effect of the label on the taste. And I love this idea that those experiments should be fast and frugal. We don't need to pay someone £20,000 to run a complex a kind of set of research. You can do it much more easily and fast and regular.
It's fascinating. I could talk to you for. It reminded me a bit of Ross McWhirter on Record Breakers years ago, when you could throw anything at you and you'd come up with some obscure fact from somewhere.
Oh, Ross McWhirter, I love that. I'm gonna
exactly
put that on my website.
Also, I can vouch that your whiteboard behind you does change every time I was speaking to you. You got a whole other stuff going on. But I'll leave it there for now, because we've got lots more to pack in. But we'll there's some questions coming through actually on the chat, which I want to look at actually about.
I'll do that.
And then but thanks, Richard. That's honestly fantastic. And as I say, we'll carry on in the panel session. Now switching attention to Nick Modi. Nick, if you could put on your nice to see you. So Nick is going to give us more of a concise look at the world of consumer trends. And I think, as Sophie was saying earlier, in Nick's role at RBC Capital Markets, he's actually advising chief executives, boards at major FMCG, household products, health and beauty, drinks brands, or what consumer trends are likely to happen over the next 4 or 5 years. So, Nick, I think you're going to give us a quick snapshot of where you see consumers going in the next 5 years. So if I hand it over to you.
Absolutely, Richard. Let me just share my screen here and we can get going. So yeah, every couple of years at RBC, we do a pretty in-depth report. It's called our Imagine series. Basically what we do is about a 6-month future study, dealing with a lot of external experts, people that are so deep in their discipline that they're able to think laterally. And out of that, we produce what we think are the key themes that will govern society globally. And then that kind of framework can be applied to any industry, whether you're in energy, drinks, beauty, personal care, or real estate. And so what I wanted to do today is share some of the learnings from that framework report that we did, and giving you some context and perspective on how to think about it in relation to the drinks market. Now, some of this stuff is going to be very high level, but again, the one thing I've learned from doing this project, and I've done it about 5 times over the last 20 years, is that everything matters to everything. And so I wanted to kind of hone in and bring it all down to the industry specific level. So the 5 themes that we've come up with through this study: the quest for immortality, the individual revolution, artificial intelligence activated, hybrid living, and the Great Balancing Act. And I'll get into each one and give a little bit of a description. So the quest for immortality, we see the simultaneous combination of breakthroughs in medicines and therapeutics. Certainly the COVID vaccine was a key part of this theme. Further advancements in healthcare availability, improving transparency in the food health connection, living conditions, and other scientific and technological improvements that we believe will ultimately extend and expand lifespans. Now, obviously during COVID, we saw somewhat of a halt to lifespans widening and broadening, but we believe that will change as we move forward due to these criteria. Now think about it today, right? We can already have a device on our arm that tells us real time what is happening in our body from a blood glucose level. This is NutriSense, which is a continuous glucose monitor. So, you know, if you're diabetic, you're going to know exactly what your blood sugar levels are all the time. If you're trying to lose weight, it's also a nice device to have so you can understand when your insulin levels are high or not. But let's fast forward and see the technologies and the innovations that are happening in labs across the world. This is at Tufts University in the United States. They've come up with a tooth sensor that can basically detect what is going on in your mouth in real time. Now, why is that important? There's a lot of data in our mouth, okay? It could detect hormones. It could tell you if you have COVID in real time, your obviously blood alcohol levels, your blood glucose levels. It can actually, through artificial intelligence, tell you if you're going to get sick based on the bacteria that's in your mouth, because what is going on in our mouth has obviously a very direct impact on our gut biome and the rest of our health. This is fascinating to think about if this was as ubiquitous as the iPhone in 5 years, right? We as consumers will now have all this rich information in real time about what is going on in our own bodies. That, my friends, is going to basically govern how we make choices and decisions. And so when you think about the beverage alcohol market or the drinks market in general, you know, having this kind of information is going to alter how you make choices. In 2020, a restaurant was opened in Tokyo called Sushi Singularity. Basically, this restaurant, you go in 2 weeks ahead of time, you provide your bio samples. I'll leave it at that. 2 weeks later, you go in and they customize a meal based on your gut biome. This is customized food, right? Based on your genetic code. And by the way, there is no chef. It is actually made through a 3D printer. And when you think about this technology and the fact that we're going to have all this information to help kind of live better lives, more healthy lives, make sure we time things properly, this extends past humans and into pets. Pretty Litter is basically a new cat litter that was recently put into the marketplace, and it could basically ascertain the cat's health, internal health, based on the color the litter turns based on the urine, right? And so again, you know, when you think about the technologies and the innovations that are existing out in the marketplace, this is just the beginning. This has become much more ubiquitous globally. The applications are going to become much more broad. And that, again, is going to give us all very rich information in which we will make choices about our lifestyles and about what we eat and what we drink. Now, other plausible implications of the quest for immortality, right? If we have longer lifespans, obviously retirements are going to be longer, okay? I don't know about many of you, but I have parents that are retired and they like to enjoy themselves with wine, with spirits, with beer. So it really makes you think, you know, what is the life cycle of the consumer much broader and longer than we are currently thinking. Expansion of the consumer spending curve and further trade up. I mean, think about what happens in Japan, one of the biggest luxury markets in the world. It's because it's one of the oldest markets in the world, and they have less desire to spend on kids because they're all out of the household, so they spend it on themselves. And so I think you're going to continue to see this structural trade up that we've been seeing. The importance of self-care and how that factors into beverage, alcohol, or drinks decision making. The further income divide. Obviously, a lot of these technologies are going to be more accessible to the higher income individuals. So you're going to see this continued bifurcation of incomes between high income and low income. Again, justifying why I believe trade up is going to continue, and perhaps more of the budget side of the market will continue to get smaller, like we've been seeing. And of course, the rising importance of mental health as we get older, and the progress on brain health and some of the remedies and solutions we see in the biotechnology world. One last word on this whole kind of health and wellness thing. I just think we need to stop talking about them as the same thing. They are really two separate things, okay? This is health, right? Low calorie, low sugar, low alcohol, okay? This is wellness. Now, obviously there's a fine line here. You don't want to overdo it when it comes to beverage alcohol consumption. But, you know, during COVID, we saw people were using social happy hours and beverage alcohol to really decompress and kind of deal and cope with the external stresses and pressures that we were seeing during that peak time in 2020. Now let's move on to the individual revolution, right? The balance of power is shifting away from traditional institutions and into the hands of the individuals. this is likely to be the single biggest disruptive force to centers of power. So think about what's happened over, the last 30, 40 years, right? And this is more of a US centric situation, but I'm sure it's applicable to every country, right? The trust in Congress and the presidency, in the church, and we're seeing this at a more global basis, right? The belief in a religion is actually starting to really continue to decline. It's been happening for 20 years, 30 years. Medical systems, our education systems, even our corporations, right? So individuals are losing trust in these kind of historic institutions that we've all kind of tried to build our lives around. Need I say more? I mean, just think about the fact that Kylie Jenner has 305 million followers, as many people that are literally in the US market. Yet the Pope has about 9 million followers. And then you can see what happens with politicians. I mean, the fact that Kylie Jenner has that many more followers than, key members of institutions, I think is very telling in terms of where we are in our society. And this is very important because these individuals are now becoming just as powerful as national marketing campaigns, right? When you think of these social media influencers and we think about the individual revolution, and literally a single person that has a heavy following can dictate and change the trajectory of a brand. And you can see here how all of these kind of content generators, these individual people, these influencer platforms are creating consumption patterns and moving people to certain brands. And what's fascinating is you think about, how much money and time many of you spend thinking about advertising or sponsorships. And here you had what I think is obviously a very inappropriate social media post. But basically some guy got in a fight with another guy and he smacked a can of Twisted Tea onto the other guy's head and it went viral, 5 million views. And guess what? Twisted Tea's growth accelerated. We saw a similar situation with Rice Krispie treats in the US, where a very popular fitness influencer said having a Rice Krispie treat before a workout is the best pre-workout snack because it's low in calories and it gives you just about enough sugar for you to get through your workout. And Rice Krispie treats started to see an acceleration. So the way brands are being built is completely being redefined and changing in this world of social media. And individuals are aligning around common causes more frequently. When you think about, we used to, aggregate in the U.S. market at church on Sundays. That's not happening. Now people are finding causes that are important to them and they're aligning with others. And it's very easy to do this, right? I remember in 2018, there was a Brazilian trucker strike and those truckers actually aligned themselves and coordinated themselves on WhatsApp. So you're seeing this happen more and more in all parts of the world where people are protesting and aligning around a certain cause and again, the individual revolution is making things change. Now, this is really, really important from a labor standpoint, right? I've seen many, many strikes. Look what happened. It's happening in Ottawa right now with the trucker strike going on there. Look what happened in the US market with Kellogg's. Every single one of their cereal plant workers went on strike at the same time, literally shutting down their production for almost an entire quarter. This is going to happen more frequently. And this is also driving people to move into the gig economy. Now we talk about labor and we worry about labor because of absenteeism from COVID or because, people have a lot of stimulus. But the reality is individuals are revolting around traditional job structures. They're looking for gig economy jobs like DoorDash and Uber. And that's why the labor force, I think, is going to be structurally impaired for some time to come because consumers and individuals are taking matters into their own hand. And social media and the internet and digital opportunities are creating job opportunities for these people. So why would I want to work in a plant or be a merchandiser for $15 an hour when I can be an Uber driver for $20 an hour and do it on my time? Artificial intelligence activated. I mean, this is pretty straightforward, but we went from a couple of years ago from people just talking about AI to now people activating it, right? You think about what's happening in terms of beverage alcohol distribution and just the ability for consumers to get products sent to their home. We have Wabi, which basically is the Uber of consumer packaged goods in Latin America, which is now being rolled out in other markets where you can be on an app, you can order your groceries or your food, and within 30 minutes, someone will bring you your product from a local mom and pop or bodega from around the corner. Coca-Cola Enterprises has made investments in companies that can deliver autonomously beverages right to your doorstep. Here's another example of Coco, which basically is another autonomous delivery mechanism that takeout restaurants are using here in the US market. And then you have other things like Bartesian, which is basically a digital cocktail maker. I mean, again, you know, the innovations that are happening are pretty robust, which is literally changing the way we consume and we interact with this category. But here's the interesting thing, folks. You know, there was a study done on AI and what people were really focusing on. And it's really interesting that people really focus on the harder things when in fact they should be really just using AI right now to deal with some of the really blocking and tackling type things like, you know, payables and receivables. So it's just, you know, within your organization, if you're looking at AI and really trying to get on the cutting edge, while it makes sense to do things that are really high and complex and kind of, you know, realign your business around AI, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that people aren't really attacking, which I think was an interesting point of this Capgemini study. Hybrid living, you know, again, our digital and physical lives are converging, and that's only going to happen more and more frequently. You know, I don't want to use the word metaverse, but, you know, it's going to be a big deal as we move into the next couple of years, right? We know people are working more from home. We understand that. We know that people are investing in their homes, right? They're buying bar carts for their homes. They're buying alcohol-related appliances. You know, once you invest in the home, you tend to use it. So again, that's why people, I believe, are going to be at home much more frequently than they were in a pre-COVID environment, even when we normalize. You know, again, the physical and digital worlds are blurring and they're coming together. I mean, think about, you know, this amazing collection of whiskeys that you could be looking at, but now we're seeing a digital twin being sold along with that really interesting bottle of whiskey. So think about this example with NFTs. Blockbar is an NFT marketplace that connects consumers and collectors with luxury wine and spirits brands. And their first launch was a 1973 Glenfiddich single malt. Okay, now along with that, there was only 15 bottles. You got a digital token that was basically the digital receipt of having this product. So again, this whole physical and digital, the worlds are converging. Now, we're not going to drink digital products, obviously, but you can see how there's opportunity to really live in a hybrid world, even in the drinks market, and take advantage of the digital world. Cocktail at-home delivery kits. I mean, again, more people staying at home more frequently. I think this is going to be a big opportunity as we move forward. And the last point I want to make on this, you know, there's a video game my kids play, Fortnite. It's called Fortnite. And they tend to have very famous people come on and do digital concerts where 20 million people will literally join for a 1-hour concert. And I've seen about 4 of these now over the last couple of years, and I see zero brand representation. I mean, what an opportunity. What an opportunity. Think about how much money you might spend to get a sponsorship of a stadium where maybe you'll get 20, 30, 80,000 people at a max at a soccer stadium. And here you have 20 million people tuning in to a digital concert and no brand is represented. Huge missed opportunity. I think there's a lot of white space in this area. And finally, on the Great Balancing Act, right? Accelerated change will lead to unprecedented instability. And we're seeing it now. Conflicts between and among subpopulations across regions and new fronts. When you think about, you know, Ukraine and Russia, you know, basic systems like democracy and capitalism will be challenged, as will individual entities themselves, like we've talked about before in the individual revolution, right? Now, this Great Balancing Act also gets down to sustainability, right? How do we toe the line between creating products that are sustainable, but the products that the consumers actually want to buy, okay? And how do we do it in a way where we don't hike up the prices to make it unreachable for the masses, right? And so you have green gen biodegradable bottles that LVMH has been working on or invested in. You know, over time, these are going to become real legitimate options for packaging. But again, we have to make sure that they work and that they're affordable, right? I like ideas like this where you have tequila companies using recycled Coca-Cola glass bottles to make their tequila bottles. I think that's brilliant. I think that's more, we have to think about this more within the drinks industry, right? But it also can work against you, right? Constellation Brands was going to build a brewery in Mexicali. There seemed to be an issue with water rights. All of a sudden, $1 billion investment in Mexicali gets written off and they have to now build a brewery somewhere else. So again, this kind of great balancing act is really towing the line between doing your business and understanding the environmental impact you're having in the environment around you. And then also we know in wine, and obviously climate change is a big issue, and what that's going to mean to, growing regions that we're so reliant on for high-end wine. Is this going to change in the future? Again, we have to think about that. How do we protect our vineyards? How do we protect our regions from the climate change that we're seeing right now? And then hacking. I know this is a drinks call and everyone is focused on the drinks market, but don't forget that you're also running organizations. And I don't think a lot of you are ready for the amount of hacking that we're going to continue to see. Think about what happened with Colonial Pipeline. It literally shut down energy delivery and distribution in half of the United States for a period of time. So again, very, very important to be aware and making sure you're safeguarding your organization for things like this that are going to happen in the future. This is the new mugging, if you will. Cybercrime is the new mugging. And the last thing I will say is just geopolitical tensions and the impact it can have, right? Russia, Ukraine, the impact it's having on the energy market. The energy market obviously is so critical to the beverage alcohol and the drinks market in terms of costs of how we produce and distribute product. So again, need to be aware of what's happening around the world to make sure that you're understanding exactly what's coming down the pike in terms of increased costs, et cetera. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Richard.
Thanks, Nate. That's brilliant. Thank you. Really, really brilliant. You managed to cover the world and the future.
15 minutes.
So, if I could ask everybody else to turn on their cameras now, we can switch to the panel debate. So, welcome to everybody sitting waiting patiently. So, can I introduce Lisa Millward, who's the Strategy and Insights Controller at Fraser Nae Copestick, Kevin Shaw, the owner and founder of Stranger and Stranger, and Joe Fattorini, who's the Managing Director for Trade at Pix. So in the next sort of 15-20 minutes, we're just going to try and explore a little bit about how the drinks industry in its different guises is actually taking some of this research and data and insights and applying it in our world, as it were. Perhaps Lisa, if I come to you first. I mean, you must be one of the few people in the drinks industry who has a job title of Strategy Insights Controller. That's which is good to see that Fraser Nae Copestick actually investing in having its own insights. Can you give us an insight into kind of what you do and what sort of tools, research tools you're using to sort of track what consumer trends are?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So we have a number of different ways that we do track consumer trends. So we have a wealth of insight from our data providers that we work with, so both quant and qual. We also we kind of do wider desk research on trends that we're seeing kind of globally, but also we tend to look quite widely at food trends, because obviously food trends kind of move into drinks trends, and that really helps to kind of know what's happening in that market as well. We also look quite closely at what's happening in the on-trade hospitality sectors, because that's quite often where we see the trends start, and they'll quite often then move into the grocery market or the off-trade market. So that's kind of always an area that we keep a close eye on. And then I guess the final thing is kind of speaking to our retail partners, to our consumers, to our customers, and asking them. It's always, everybody is a consumer, so it can be quite helpful just to ask those questions to kind of friends, family, and kind of get feedback on why they're buying specific products, and quite often why they're not. That's also quite interesting to know. The team at Fraser Nae Copestick, we have a small category team, and they basically look at a lot of all of these pieces of kind of all of these data points, and we use all of that to kind of turn that into insights. And I think that's the key thing. It's also having the people to be able to do that, so kind of having the right resource to be able to look at all the data that we actually have access to and putting that into something that is really useful and insightful, and then using that to kind of shape NPD and future innovation.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned food there, and actually looking outside of just the wine sector for what you do. Is that something which, I guess, if you're working with the major supermarkets, are they looking for that? They're looking for a more rounded analysis of the consumer rather than saying consumers like drinking Chardonnay more than they like drinking Sauvignon Blanc? Or...
Yeah, I think so, because I think when we work in the industry, and I think we talked about it earlier through some of the other talks, that actually we're very, quite often when we've worked in the industry for a while, we kind of forget sometimes a little bit about the consumer, and actually it's bringing it back to what are people doing in their wider kind of day-to-day repertoire, because that obviously that is relevant to drinks and NPD. So yes, I think there is a lot of influence that comes from kind of the food market. I suppose a category like coffee is quite a good example of, it's actually quite similar to wine in some ways, and it is quite a complex category. But it's broadened out. There's been ways to trade up within coffee, and that's a good kind of example of something that is similar to wine, but is actually a really valuable category, and people are kind of spending a lot in that category. They're trying to take kind of influence from other categories, but also looking at what's going on within food, definitely to bring it back to drinks as well.
Excellent, thank you. Kevin, the world of design and packaging. I mean, listening to what Richard was talking about earlier on, I mean, getting your head into the mindset of the consumer when they're standing in front of a supermarket aisle or standing in front of a bar. I mean, can you just give an insight into some of the, I mean, do you use some of those sort of techniques, or have you, how do you go about actually deciding what is going to catch someone's eye?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of, sounding like a pimp for Richard, I read this book a while back, and as far as I remember, there's a couple of dozen ways of looking at things or themes. There you go. There it is right there.
There's a
and yeah, no, and at least a third of them were directly related to what we do in creating brands and creating packaging. And from the very, very basic, I think he talked about expectancy theory, or about how presentation is as important as the product, and that's been proven in research groups, and that people taste things differently depending on how it looks. So that directly affects on how we design things. And he talked about price relativity, making things look more expensive than they should, appearing better value. And that way of structuring ranges. We do a lot of icon brands and diffusion brands to pump up the middle brand, and those things work all day. He talked about distinctiveness, about standing out and zigging and zagging, and also just as a point just been made about taking inspiration from other categories, looking at perfume and food, and this is something we do all the time and have done forever. I mean, I was so happy when I read his book. I thought, oh yeah, we're doing all this stuff. It's great. The power of stories, really, really important. That and then being able to punch that out. I think there was something about primacy, about the primacy effect, about first impressions counting. Be very single-minded on your message and get that really, really clear. Scarcity, obviously. I mean, you'll see that on labels, from everything from limited release to these things where, we just package 5 bottles and everybody in China wants them. The less there is, the more you want it.
Well, you're starting to take a risk, though. I mean, part of, I always think of Stranger and Stranger, that some of your designs are kind of like designs you've not seen before. So in a way, it's part of it taking all that kind of learned science, as it were, but also then having the risk to then do something completely different with it as well.
Well, I think that goes back to zigging and zagging and standing out, especially in the truck market that we're in, which is the weirdest market on earth. I mean, there's nothing else like it in terms of just the number of products. So you have to look at what's around. You have to make your product look more expensive, and you have to make your product look distinctive. And there's all weird little things as well. Like I do remember this thing, and I've never heard it before, called the Pratfall Effect, about floors making something more human or more distinctive. And I remember 20 years ago, a client, we would design these perfect labels, and then he'd say, okay, now what can we just move, or what can we just make a bit off? Because if something's off, your eye goes straight to it, and it works every time. And I think we've been doing that ever since. What would appear to be perfect, but then there's something about the message or something in the illustration that shoots your eye straight through it and tells you a story. The one that I haven't been cracked yet is the life events, and I've been trying to get this one going forever because it's fascinating. The people, what Richard didn't mention is people at the end of a decade, 19, 29, 39 years old, have different expectations and will try things and all this sort of thing. And I've been trying to leverage this forever. If anybody wants to do a JV with me on this, I'm all over it. Yeah. It's fascinating. It's something we've been doing for a long time. It was perfectly encapsulated in Richard's book, and I do not get any commission if you go out and buy it.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. Joe, coming to you now. Richard actually mentioned also in his presentation this idea of doing a lot of A/B testing on online, and how online, in a way, is the perfect vehicle or perfect platform even to do a lot of this kind of like experimentation. And now PIX, just to sort of like allow you to sort of explain what PIX is, but you've had to do a lot of understanding how the consumer searches online for PIX to even exist. So do you want to just give us a little bit of insight into how PIX is using some of this behavioural understanding online?
Totally, and actually I'm very fortunate because I have a Lisa, where I've got a director of analytics and insights, and in many ways it distills a lot of what we're talking about, because my director of analytics and insights, Sarah, she was a clinical research psychologist who's also a data scientist. It's the sort of perfect combination of these two skill sets to go and bring together heuristics, and then how do we go and investigate those? PIX is an online wine search platform. So we launched in the US 4 weeks ago. It's now the second largest, fastest growing wine selection online. And if you were to distill, I mean, I'm also a terrible Richard shill, because I was actually at the launch of his book in London, and we met there after we went and gave the talk. You could go and dip in and say, well, when we try different things. We try the von Restorff effect we go and use. We have all these different bits, but there's one that really becomes a challenge, which is around that choice paralysis. So Richard is there talking about Brewdog. Brewdog brews 36 beers. Our starting database was 250,000 wines. I've now got 5 million offers already that people can choose from across the United States. So this sort of choice is absolutely enormous. So what we've ended up doing is not just about looking at the heuristics, it's about going and looking at how other people have solved it. So Starbucks has 87,000 choices that you could potentially make from a Starbucks coffee shop. So let's look at how they start structuring their menu, because actually it's quite easy to go and choose a Starbucks, even though there's 87,000 choices there. You don't know that they're there because of the way it's structured. There are 5,500 films or shows on Netflix. So we actually teamed up with a guy who'd created the Netflix tagging system, because they moved away from consumer reviews and into tagging. And he helped us to go and work around the way that our dynamic merchandising engine tags wines. And we've done a lot of underlying testing of those through the Director of Insights to see, well, what words, what combinations of words, what types of words appeal to people to get them to click through, that help them make those choices. I mean, how many Audible books are there? It's hundreds of thousands. There's probably about 250,000 Audible books. I don't know. It's of that sort of order. We're very fortunate because I'm in California, and that's Palo Alto is not far away, and we know people who work in that field. So we've looked at the way Audible and Kindle and so on is a very similar long tail. There's something that's quite a long way down the tail, which is the perfect choice for you. How do you help people zoom in? That's essentially by clustering, making that big world small. We call them collections. They sort of have these categories, and they can be weird. You can play around with stuff, because actually wine values are important. We have a master of wine. It matters that it fits that structure that we know from wine, and we shouldn't move away from that. You shouldn't belittle it. But lots of people, that's not the frame that they look at wine through. So you have to create alternative routes into finding, well, how do you choose your wine? Is it by the occasion? Is it by what values you have? And that's even down into our search bar. So the search bar is an open search. You don't search for wines. You can go in and search for pizza. You'll find 1,500 different wines that go with pizza. So that's a lot of the way we do it. Actually, that sort of paradox of choice is the biggest single challenge you have to overcome behaviorally.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think we're all become so, aware of the fact that decisions are being made for us by whatever platform we're on, be it Amazon telling us to buy this or moving here and but can I I mean, I'm aware of our time actually. I can't believe we've only actually got about sort of five minutes left. Just perhaps broadening it out to bring Nick and Richard into the conversation as well. One thing that strikes me about the drinks industry and wine in particular, there's a lot of rules and regulations around wine. We're all told about how to taste a glass of wine. There's a sort of a right way of doing it and a wrong way of doing it. There's a right way of holding a wine glass even. There's there's a right way of pairing of food. There's a certain food that you pair a certain wine with. White wine with fish and all the rest of it. Nick, can I ask you, going back to what you were talking there before about some of the big consumer trends, is an industry that has so many of those rules and regulations in danger of alienating itself from a consumer that wants more personalization, wants more freedom, wants more of a voice, or can it sit within that?
Yeah, no, I think it can sit. I mean, take the Bartesian example, right? I mean, you can customize whatever drink you want within your own home based on capsules, right? It's almost like what's happening with coffee with Starbucks and Keurig with the Keurig machines or the Nespresso machines. So I don't think this whole notion of personalization needs to get away or leave the drinks industry behind. And also you think about the amount of content that resides online to help you understand literally for any dish possible that you would eat, that there's a wine pairing that some person has tried somewhere in the world and is now recommending it online, right? So again, I just, the robustness of the information I think can be used to the advantage of the industry for sure.
Okay. Richard, I don't know whether there's a thing about people being told what they can and can't do, or being having sort of set rules. Is that something which is a good or bad thing in terms of what behavioral science?
Well, I guess going back to what Joe was saying, having a rule, even if it's completely arbitrary, and I know nothing about wine, so I don't know which ones are arbitrary and which ones aren't, but white wine and fish that I think you just mentioned, Richard, that people know whether or not there are lots of exceptions. But I guess that is something that allows people to go from considering an infinite amount of wines to a smaller group. So there are some benefits. I guess the danger becomes if people start to feel it's too much effort. It's kind of not for them because of the rules and structures. But I think, yeah, one of the themes that's come out from tonight is one sort of the technology part is more and more information, but there are some real paradoxes with that. There's a lovely Nobel economist, Herbert Simon, who won Nobel Prize for Economics back in, I think, late 70s, 78, I think. And he said something along the lines of a wealth of information creates a scarcity of attention. Information essentially consumes our attention. So the more information we have, actually you create a problem, and the total amount of attention we have over a day is exactly the same. So with more information, people then put a greater priority on choosing quickly, and therefore you start defaulting back more and more to these rules of thumb. So they might be industry specific ones, like the wine and the white fish, or it might be, well, pick the most popular one. Pick the one which is really expensive because it's probably going to be higher quality. Pick the one that admits a flaw somewhere else, like Kevin was mentioning. I think greater information makes choice harder, and when choice becomes hard, people search for a simple solution, which is one of these rules of thumb which psychology is based around. And if you look in the chat, Joe has got the full quote, beautiful quote.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, well, just a last question of the last 2 minutes before we pull this together. I mean, coming back to you, Lisa, is that something which you in your work ultimately it's all about? That is about taking all the insights that you're having for Agent and Coach, and then being able to extrapolate that right down into be it the name of a brand, a tagline, an image. Is that ultimately the challenge, is to make it as clear and as simple as possible?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think wine is, we know wine is a complex category. And I think, as Richard said, sometimes the more complicated it is, it can be off-putting for some people. There are some people that understand wine and are happy to kind of come back and they know what they're looking for. But I think, wine is up against other categories that are making choices simpler. So absolutely, it is all about trying to make it as simple as possible for people to come into that category for the first time, to trial something, to like it, and then come back again. And that's ultimately, what we want to do in terms of growing the wine category, is bringing new people in and kind of getting them to have that first experience and trial it, and then go on to be repeat purchases in the category.
Brilliant. Okay. And Joe, just a final word from you in terms of, like, you're obviously creating a platform that has thousands and thousands of wine, but you obviously don't want it to detract away from how complex wine is as well.
Exactly that. And I want to be able to create, well, it's not binary. I want you to be able to go and look for a deuxième, Grand Cru Classé claret from Bordeaux, and to know that it's great for aging, which is a frame that many of us in the wine world are very familiar with. I also want you to be able to go and find a wine that's got a funny dog on the label, because that is also very important for many wine drinkers out in the world. And the two can come together, and behavioral science is in many ways one of the ways you can do that.
Brilliant. And a final word from you, Kevin. I mean, in terms of where do you see packaging and design going this year? Smaller bottles, different formats, eco bottles? You mute yourself, Chief. Mute.
Yeah, people are trying the eco bottles. I hope, as I say every single time, I just hope there's more. Sorry. I just hope that there's more innovation as much innovation in the wine world as we see in the other sectors. I mean, going back to Richard's line about drawing inspiration from other categories. Yeah, I'm fingers crossed on that one.
Brilliant. Okay, well, so we could talk for another half an hour, I'm sure, but we're aware of our time. So can I just say thanks to everybody, Richard, Nick in particular, for your presentations, and to Joe, Lisa, and Kevin for your panel as well. So back to you, Sophie.
No, just to reiterate that, thank you all for our usual fast and furious session. Half of our panelists are in the US, so you've all been up super early, and you're all looking good. So thank you for that. We'll be circulating the recording, because I'm sure there's plenty for everyone to look over in more detail. So have a good evening, have a good day, everyone. And thank you to all of you who've participated. See you next time.
Excellent. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.